Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. And it's absolutely fantastic to be chatting with everyone this evening, looking at Russia's offensive capacity in 2024 and what we're seeing at the moment. It is crazy to see how much has changed. Effectively, there is very little times I've seen a single conflict where everyone just goes, is this report from before 2022 or after 2022? Because this has changed how we look at the Russian military, what we think about the capacity of the Russian military, how they're structuring stuff. They've abandoned some programs, put some further down the line. There's also a lot of people going the other way where they go, oh, well, Russia isn't winning against Ukraine. Obviously, this is a nothing army. And I think that's probably a bit of an overcorrection. So the plan here is we're going to go through all the Russian military and then also take a look at the Baltic front, what the war plans would be and what it was likely going to look like. As always, there's lots and lots and lots of maps in these things. So I think the best place to start with this is for anyone who's maybe the first time they've come to one of these. The last one was looking at the Soviets' 7-day to the Rhine plan and just showing how absolutely insane that was. And I think a pretty good kind of context start for this is to just examine how far down the war goals have fallen. The last plans we were looking at, the Soviets were supposedly going to get to the Spanish border and they were taking on all of Europe. Now the war goals we're looking at are maybe getting the Baltics if they're lucky, which is a massive fall from where they were back in the 80s. So I think it's probably just a good place to start. So a lot of these war games were extensively done about 2015. There was a lot of money put in by various US departments effectively after Crimea. I think people realized at that point that, whoops, maybe we're going to have a more aggressive Russia than we've seen. We've also seen this scenario run time and time again by NATO and Russia. And there's lots of data we can look at. So let's take a look at why the Baltics actually matter. This is a map of NATO and the CSTO. And again, I don't personally feel the Russians are in any danger, but if you speak to Russian military officers, which fairly often or semi-often these days, they tend to all give you a bit of paranoia about what they think might come. They all know exactly how many kilometers Hitler had to advance to get close to Moscow. So the reason that the Baltics are so important to the Russians effectively is because they know that there's no NATO invasion from the south. No one's coming through Afghanistan. No one's going to come through Turkmenistan. No one's coming through the Caucasus. It's just, and with Ukraine being neutral in this scenario or effectively just not being a NATO ally, they can't come through there. Obviously, Belarus gives them some breathing space, so that makes it more difficult. And also, NATO wouldn't want to go against a state that is neutral or has not got involved in the war directly. And we'll go through that a bit later. Norway, they're not going to come through that. It's just an absolute nightmare to try and invade from that angle. The Baltics are the real problem because in the Baltics, you effectively have Petersburg very, very close. You have a lot of major rail points and major assembly points along here, as well as Moscow not too far from here. So that's always been a concern having the Baltics in NATO hands. But if they could effectively push the Baltics out, they could make the defensive line here, which is a lot shorter to defend. This has always been the kind of nightmare scenario for Russia that they used to have a defensive line. Effectively, they could concentrate everything along here, and now they have to concentrate all of Norway, all of Finland, all of the Baltics, and then down, all the way through around Ukraine. And yeah, if they could take the Baltics, that does shorten the problem here. The Baltics, again, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, there's not really too much special about the geography. They're all pretty flat. They're all pretty marshy at times. The only 2 or 3 real geographic obstacles you probably have to think about a bit are the rivers. Some of them are deeper than others, particularly this one here, the one that runs through Latvia. That is genuinely going to be a problem. We'll encounter later. So let's talk Russian positions. And before we get into that, I want to just quickly go through a bit of symbology with everyone, because that way you'll understand what these maps mean. Now, usually symbology is far simpler. If we're going off NATO standards here. You'll see this kind of symbol all the time. That's a motor rifle unit. That's an infantry unit. These are just kind of stylized ones because, frankly, once you get off just red versus blue teams, it gets really difficult to know who's who. Also, just, I like graphic design. And I think it's a lot nicer to have them a bit more colorful and vibrant. So effectively, if you see this cross with a circle in it, that's going to be a motor rifle unit or a motorized unit. If it's got just a X, it's going to be a roughly infantry unit. And the lightning bolt, it means it's rapid response, special forces, your very quick moving guys. And obviously there's lots of different units, and we'll go through in much more detail. So let's talk Baltic positions. And this is where I am going to be odd. I'm going to go off to Photoshop because this way I have all my layers and I can turn things on and off. So let's start and talk about how Europe sits today, and we'll talk about NATO first, and then we'll move off to Russia. And you can see this is roughly the positioning of every military base in Europe, or every major military unit deployment in Europe. So you can see here on the, this is why I like the zoom in, the X here, that's a brigade. So some of these units you'll see where like France has got 3X, that's an army group. That's going to be much, much, much bigger than a brigade. And I've just kind of cut this off at brigade or regiment level, because frankly, otherwise we would look, let me show you what it looks like. If we keep it at what every level is, this is what the Russian, what Russia would actually look like. And it's just a nightmare of dots. So we're going to keep it to effectively the bigger units, because most of your smaller units are going to just fold into the bigger units anyway. We can see here that NATO has not too much deployed in the Baltics. It's often been seen as more of a wire force, effectively, that the Baltics would hold out long enough that NATO might be able to come in, and we'll explain why it's only been a true wire force in a bit, because it's much easier to explain during the operation. Belarus has a lot of looking units, but frankly, they're all absolutely terrible. The Belarusian forces are really poorly armed, and that's coming from someone who looks at Central Asian militaries all day. Sweden, again, you can see here this difference in sort of military styling. You've got Poland, which is really sort of spaced out. They're all over the country. That's quite often done because they want to spread the jobs out across all these areas. Because remember, if you put a base, there's a lot of guys buying stuff from the pub everywhere else. Whereas some other countries are just going to be concentrated in certain areas. Hungary, for instance, is pretty concentrated right there in the center. Sweden, a lot of smaller units. They only run things at regiment level, which is a lot smaller than what you usually expect. But generally, that's what NATO is looking at. Let's zoom out a bit. The one that obviously everyone's asking about is Russia. What is Russia looking like before and after? And this is I've left Ukraine out of this one at the moment, and that's probably worth its whole thing. But this is a usual standard deployment for Russia. If it were peacetime, no war had happened, this is kind of what the Russian bases and systems would look like. So you can see there's a concentration around Moscow. We've got some paratroops up here. We've got some rapid response guys. There's not a huge amount concentrated all around the Baltics on the day-to-day, because they're not really expecting an invasion from the Baltics. There's no massive NATO forces. There's no real massive offensive capacity in there. And you can see that Kaliningrad's actually got a fair amount of troops, but not quite enough that you think it's the end of the world. But and I've got my Donbass guys here, but generally that's what it looks like. And now let's unveil the horrors. Right now, that is what is currently sitting in the east of Europe. It's actually a lot of units have been brought in from other parts of the country. And what you can see here, if I flick between the two, is that they actually haven't dragged a lot of these Western-leaning units away yet. A couple of reasons. One, A, they're going to be better at defending the West. That's what they're used to. B, people from the West tend to be, they probably came from the West, particularly richer ones who can bribe their way into a Western unit where they can, if they're based in Veliki Novgorod, it's a lot easier for them to go in the weekend to do Petersburg rather than if they're based way out in Siberia where things can get pretty miserable. So the units they've chucked in here, let's get back to our into Ukraine deployment. Yeah, are mostly dragged from Central Area Command. They're dragged from Eastern Area Command. There are some units that are just direct subordinate stuff. It's a whole bunch of odd units in there, but it just gives you an idea that Russia does still have a offensive capacity sitting here in the West. They wouldn't want to use that because effectively this is now acting as the reserve. If Ukraine were to make a massive breakout and get really behind the lines, Russia now has forces they can pull from other places. And we'll go through a few bits and pieces on why we have chosen the deployments for this operation that we have. So let's look at the main Baltic front. So these are the main Baltics, and the first thing everyone looks at is the odd placement of things. Why would you put these guys here, and why would you have Estonian forces and NATO advanced forces effectively deployed, not in Tallinn, but in weird spots? And I can almost hear everyone saying it because I'm the biggest advocate of this, and I will continuously yell about this all the time. It's all about the train lines. There we go. There's our train lines. So we can actually see here why everything is deployed exactly the way it is already because of these train lines. The Estonian forces, you can see here, are effectively guarding that train intersection in here. These guys are making sure they can't get down to this line because trains are incredibly important to the Russians. And let's go back to our presentation now. We'll talk about trains for a bit because I'm a chubby white guy. Of course, I know about trains. So effectively, the Russians have built their military around the dependence on trains. Right now, they moved a few years ago to this system called Material Technical Support Troops, effectively dedicated rail support. A bit better than what they used to do with the Soviets, has a bit more flexible capacity in it, but really not. It's why the general rule of thumb is how far can the Russian army advance? About 50 k's outside its train line is about right. So they are the primary method of moving stuff about. And right now, so an MTO battalion is going to have about 1,000 personnel, 400 vehicles, general freights and specialized stuff from trailers. Generally, everything, and this is why I kind of put this right at the front of the presentation, should have in the back of your mind that the Russians will rely on these train lines for everything. And they will stick to the train lines wherever possible, because right now, their entire system relies on trains being able to support them, to bring the ammo up, to bring the machine up, to bring the tanks up. Because A, you don't want to drive your tanks any further than you do, because tank gearboxes are notoriously bad. Why would you waste your, let's call it, 10,000 kilometers you might get out of a tank on running down random Estonian highways when you can transport it to the nearest rail hub, take it off, and actually have it ready for war? The other trouble that in Europe has, or this area has, is broad gauge versus standard gauge. And again, we're getting a bit down the route, down the off track. But broad gauge is your wider track stuff. That is going to be mostly Soviet aligned areas. Because remember, it's to do broad gauge to standard gauge means you have to actually get everything off the train and transfer it to a different rolling stock. That's why right now Europe effectively is, these countries have broad gauge and the rest of Europe's on standard gauge, and the Baltics are moving to standard gauge. So it's why Russia would have huge problems getting into Europe, because they don't have any train lines ready for them. So let's say they want to go invade Poland, they'd have to actually get to the edge of Poland, dump it off broad gauge, put it onto standard gauge, and then re-get it and go from there. That's a horrifying mess, and they don't have a lot of rail stock that sits in standard gauge anyway. So even in the best doctrines, so the Soviets could do about 30 to 40 k's. The Russians, on a good day, if you give them 2 brigades, could do about 30 to 50 kilometers of broad gauge track a day. That's unimpeded. That's no one shooting at them. That's having a good day. They've had all their vodka rations and they're happy campers. So if you think how far the Polish border is to Berlin, there's going to be a long time, a lot of railway to build there. So effectively, even with the best days, it's 7 hours to get your gear off a train and get it back on a train. So it just means that any operation where they don't have a train, it's going to delay them at best by, let's call it 14 hours. And that's if they're in a good condition. It's longer because what if an air raid comes by? Maybe this stuff isn't stacked properly. The labels probably aren't correct. There's going to be a whole bunch of problems there. So again, rail is absolutely important. And before we get back into maps, I want to talk about the difference in logistics here. What people don't understand about Russian logistics, particularly in the ground forces, is they have a push system rather than a pull system. So let's talk, this is our theoretical scenario. So this is a pull system. This is what the Americans and NATO and your standing kind of forces would use. So this is a front line, it's a nice blue front line. Our center troop comes under attack. He radios headquarters and says, "Oh my God, please send me some ammunition. I'm getting under attack." And headquarters quickly sends him 3 boxes of ammunition. That's how pull logistics works. The Russians, though, go on push logistics. Now, this is why the trains are so important, because we have our 3 men again. One comes under attack. He calls headquarters and says, "Hey, I need more ammunition." And doesn't matter, because everything on push logistics is decided months in advance. So when you hear the Russians say, "Oh, even during Prigozhin's thing and everyone else, our logistics ran on time," it's because they plan the logistics out to expecting that their commanders are not able to adequately decide how much ammunition they need. It means that everybody gets a little bit, but no one gets it where they need. Because to do what the US does and have real, need it where and when you need it, requires lots of last mile travel, which is the really difficult bit. It's the getting from the railhead to the front line, which is going to require more trucks, more armored trucks, those kind of things that are expensive, difficult, and fuel intensive. And the Russians aren't particularly good at that. So that's why they go with this push logistics, which is we're just going to push a bunch down the line and we'll decide where it goes 2 weeks in advance. And I hope it's right. But it makes it completely foolproof. You could kill everyone in high command and you still have boxes and boxes of ammunition rocking up. It might be the wrong ammunition and it might be rocking up in the wrong place, but it's going to rock up. So before we get into first strikes, there are probably a few assumptions we want to go through. I'm going to assume here that Biden is president. Let's just make it because he's just far easier to predict. I think we'll assume that the war in Ukraine has gone somewhat quiet. If Ukraine was making a massive offensive at the time, I don't think the Russians would look to do this. In fact, I don't think the Russians would look to do this unless it had quieted down to effectively where they were at 2016 levels. The other big assumption that Russia will have to make is avoiding nuclear war. And this shapes the entire conversation is how far can Russia push this before they get a nuclear response or before the West feels it's going to get a nuclear response from Russia. And that's very, very much going to be on everyone's minds because, again, I don't think Russia would go and do this because it is just a massive risk of nuclear war for what is not a great defensive game. But that's always going to keep that in the back of your mind during the whole time. And the other one is this is probably going to be a quick war. Russia went into Ukraine expecting it to be effectively a 10-day war. That was the amount of supplies that they all got given. By 10 days, it was expected that they hand over a lot of sort of guard duties and occupation force work to the Rosgvardia. Didn't happen. So Russia in its war games and in the early war games was expecting to hit Tallinn and Riga, so here and here, at the 60-hour mark. But the other big choice they would have to make is 2 or 3 Baltic states. And this is if they were, let's say, go and just do Estonia and Latvia, it doesn't give them the short line they were hoping for. But it also does make it a bit more flexible a response because A, you can almost hostage Lithuania off, sorry. B, if you put troops into Lithuania, you're now fighting in Lithuania. And that means you're stuck now. It also means you're likely going to have to get the Belarusians more involved than you want to because the trouble with Belarus, and it's why they haven't really got too involved in Ukraine, is they just don't have the military capacity to do so. They've got dog shit ammunition, dog shit equipment, and because Lukashenko has been increasingly paranoid over years, he's only really given the really good stuff to particularly loyal units or particularly paratroop units. Effectively, it's why the only units sitting in Minsk are the 120th, who are quite loyal to Lukashenko. Effectively, he's thinking about this as a force that will protect him against protesters. And because Belarusians have quite often good relations with Lithuanians, they probably don't want to get involved in this war. Russia doesn't want to go and trade, hey, let's bring in 3 brigades of Belarusian troops. Oh, great, now there's riots in Belarus and I need to put 12 brigades of Russian troops in just to quell the riots. It's just not a good deal. So going and doing Lithuania as well is a bit of a gamble because you would have to do Kaliningrad and Belarus involved, and you might get all 3. If you get Estonia and Latvia, see how well you go, and then from there decide. That's probably the better way to go. And it's why when this has been played out, quite often they find, particularly when guys like US Navy War College play this out, the teams that play just Estonia, Latvia tend to do better than the guys that try and get Lithuania as well. That's the other sort of problem here is that the moment you pull off your troops from Kaliningrad, it makes Kaliningrad very vulnerable. So if you keep them right there, Lithuania can't really get too involved because they're worried about being invaded. And also you can hold your defensive positions, which are pretty fortified inside Kaliningrad. So let's get into a day 0 deployment. So effectively, we are, in this scenario, going to try and keep it as realistic as possible. And we're looking at who Russia could draw enough troops from. They don't want to deploy everything they have sitting in the area. If they can avoid it, they'll deploy most of it. But let's drag in the Second Combined Arms Army, which most of the time is based in Samara, usually, which is fine. And the 5th Combined Arms, which is based in Yurosisk, which so effectively we're dragging guys from the middle of the country and the very end of the country. We'll also drag another division of VDV or paratrooper troops. Although don't think of them as paratroopers, the Russians really don't use them very much as airborne troops. They're mostly just lighter, more mobile, supposedly better fighting, supposedly better armed forces. We could have a debate a long time about that, but generally the VDV are pretty good at moving quickly, except when it comes to Kiev. So we're going to move those guys. We're going to use the local deployments as well. We're not going to worry about Roskvardia in this scenario. We'll talk about that later. Roskvardia are kind of your internal forces. They are, I guess, the closest US equivalent would be National Guard, but far more involved in day-to-day operations. So let's move into place. We're going to assume that the Allies don't see this, or NATO doesn't see this. I don't think that's realistic, but we're going to be generous to the Russians here to make it interesting. We're also going to assume that no one chucks a bunch of deployments in or changes the deployment structures. But the first strike is likely going to be precision weapons. That's what the Russians tried in Kiev, or in most of Ukraine. It's what they're likely to try here. The difference with precision weapons is effectively you can target exactly the infrastructure you want. You also don't want to kill too many civilians. I mean, it's the classic of, if I'm going to steal a car, do I want to smash the windshield in before I take it? And the answer is probably not, if I can avoid it. So you want to be attacking, command and control hubs, ammunition storages, fuel storages, power facilities, whatever you think will make it easier with your precision weapons, because you've probably got one shot as well to get rid of any air defense that you think is there. Where Russia did really well in Ukraine in the very early stages is they hit about 75% of the static air defense was in Ukraine. They only hit about 10% of the mobile air defense, which is where Russia will be paranoid again, because they just didn't know where these guys are. The Ukrainians are effectively moving their mobile air defense every couple of hours. So when Russia launched their, a lot of them weren't in the spots they did. And the Ukrainians were very much smart enough to, Russians would miss the target and the Ukrainians would radio saying, oh, they've hit the target. And Russia would pat themselves on the back, not realizing there was a giant air defense system sitting there. So yeah, Russia has a bad tendency to, I've always heard it described as reinforce bad behavior, where they, cock up but they want to get the job done. So they just keep sending wave and wave after men. We're going to assume that Zap Brannigan's been fired from the Russian army for today and give them somewhat modicum of intelligence and just show that it really isn't poor planning that'll kill the Russians. It's just the general problems with an invasion like this, with what you've got left over and what you can do. So we can see effectively massive amount of strikes. There's going to be lots and lots more, but we're going to go with the two country scenario here. I think it's the smartest one. I think it's the one I would probably do if I was Russia. For Estonia, the key targets are going to be Armory Airfield up here, which is way back up here. And it's also going to be the rail hubs, and it's going to be Tallinn Port, even though Tallinn Port's not huge. And here's the good thing. We can turn stuff on and off as we need, which is nice. Let's turn all the flags off. So here we go. We can see effectively what we're hitting here is the key infrastructure. Let's turn flags back on and let's go to day 1.5. So this is effectively what the actual invasion point is. So with Ukraine, they effectively had three main punches. They had the main force coming from Gomel. They had another one coming from, down from Cherniv, and then they had another one coming from the east as well. We're going to assume they can probably do three good punches here as well, with the main punch going to be up here in Tallinn, up here in the north. The idea would be that punch in as quick as possible and then barrel down, down the Baltics and see how far you get. And if you get to the 60 hours and you've taken Latvia, congrats. You can probably think maybe we talk about Lithuania at that point. But if you don't, you can stop at Lithuania, and maybe that gives NATO a cutoff point to stop. Because again, you don't want to just barrel in and start nuclear war if you can avoid it. Better to overestimate your enemy. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a huge thing. One of the other big saviors of Ukraine in the early period, particularly Kiev, was the fact that they had a bunch of just conventional massed artillery sitting around Kiev. Russia was hoping for effectively a 12-1 advantage in artillery, which is what they kind of have quite a lot when they really want to get things going. In Kiev, it was a 2-1, which is nowhere near enough for what they needed it to do. We don't see that massed amount of artillery here in the Baltics. So there's probably not enough to push the Russians back. They are, in essence, going to be a bit of a token force that does its job well. But we're going to follow the rail line. Effectively, we'll push through. We'll talk about Narva a bit later because that's a really interesting case. But the aim here will be to get this rail junction here, where the Estonian second sitting, and the all-important rail junction down here. This is the big one that everyone really needs, because it will connect this entire road to Vilnius. If you want to do that, it connects you down, allows you to run supplies up and down this river here, and also allows you to connect in with the Russian rail network. They're not going to use Belarus for now, but this is generally what your day one is probably going to look like if they can get that far. Because there's really not that much sitting in any of these border places. Their first resistance is going to be the base here and the base here. And let's go back to our presentation. So NATO, what happens with NATO? Okay. I will give 10 points to anyone who can tell me who this person is. Either chat, because I don't know who it is. Anyone? So this is Julianne Smith, the US ambassador to NATO, and the person who NATO will actually have to decide whether they go to war. What people don't realize is that Article 5 is not an automatic thing. It absolutely is not an automatic thing. That was part of the design, the program, that it wasn't going to be automatic, but also it stops things happening like when Ukraine fired that missile and missed the target, hit Poland. We didn't automatically just all pile in on Ukraine. That's the point where it's not automatic. So the terrifying thing about the ambassador to NATO is it is a political appointment. So Julian was picked by Biden. I don't want to pick on her too much, but she's very conventional Washington foreign policy person. She spent time with a few think tanks, CSIS particularly, has been working in and out of policy, has been an advisor to effectively a bunch of ambassadors, very standard foreign policy kind of guy, or woman, sorry. Whereas the previous one before her, a woman named Kay Bailey Hutchinson, was appointed by Trump. That woman was originally the Texas treasurer of the Republican Party, who ran for Texas Senate a bunch of times, got indicted for record tampering in campaign finance, as well as doing some stuff with the Texas Treasury. She's an oil and gas person and has had no foreign policy, military, or political experience on that one. This is a big question mark around when people go, oh, well, we got Article 5, we've got NATO, doesn't matter what happens. There is a major question of, let's say if this war happens and Trump was to, and again, I'm not going to just sit here and bash Trump, I'm not that guy, but if Trump does appoint someone to this position, which he is in perfect rights to do so, Article 5 comes up. Estonia has said, hey, look, I've been invaded, and brings it to the North Atlantic Council, which North Atlantic Council is effectively the political body of NATO that decides what to do. This is where you start to hit problems because there isn't really a concrete mechanism onto whether the ambassador could say yes and the president says no. So let's say if Julian here said, yes, let's go to war, but Biden said no, we don't really know what the capacity is there because technically it is up to the decision of the representative at NATO, with the expectation that the representative would relay their country's wishes. But it gets really murky. And this is a real kind of question that everyone's asking. The NAC would meet. So again, we're not going to get an automatic 2-second thing for Article 5. They're not going to respond. Debate on the response, and it must reach a consensus. And depending on how you want to read Article 9 and Article 4, as well as Article 12, because 12 governs the rules for the NAC, this could be universal, and would have any country could veto this. So you could have Orban say, no, not getting involved in Estonia, not my business. No, NATO is not going to war. You have Trump do it. You could have Montenegro do it. You could have any of these countries veto it, and it wouldn't get through. And that's a real concern that maybe some of these countries might be willing to go down that road. I don't think so. I think NATO is probably more united now after Ukraine than it ever has been, or at least since the Cold War. But it is definitely a concern that the consensus must be reached. What they could do is a coalition of the willing, effectively a bunch of nations who will just unilaterally say they'll work together and do this. There's nothing stopping them doing that. The trouble would be for the US not to be in that coalition then. Because as much as the French and the British and everyone can bang their chests and say we're real powers too, they don't have the airlift logistics or the sea power logistics or just the massive amount of stuff that you're going to need to get a war like this going and move everything really quickly. To bring in stuff through French logistics is going to be a lot slower than just chucking everything through Ramstein and a few other places where it is much more advantageous for the US. So if I was a concerned person, I would always be wondering who Trump is going to put as the ambassador to NATO. So let's look at NATO's first response. NATO can start scrambling stuff on their own accord, as we can see here down in Poland. Poland's starting to pull some troops up here. I'm a bit concerned that maybe this is the start of World War III, but we're not going to see troops or boots on the ground, in the first day or so. We can talk about that a bit later, but what you've got is these forward deployed rapid forces. Effectively, they are made up of a whole bunch of different NATO nations. So I can give you the exact who's in what. I'm a man of many notes. So if we're looking at Estonia, their NATO force deployed up here. Also at Amri, that's got France, Denmark, Iceland, the UK, and the US in it. And it's about 2,500 troops. If we're looking at the force here in Latvia, that is Canada, Denmark, Czechia, Montenegro, Slovakia, Albania, Spain, Italy, Poland, Slovenia, North Macedonia, this annoyed the Greeks, Iceland, and the US, and that's about 4,000. And then over in Lithuania, that's only Belgium, Czechia, Luxembourg. Hey, Luxembourg, you're in this. Good work. You bought something. Netherlands, Norway, USA, Germany, Iceland, and the USA. And that's about 3,500 men. So these aren't huge forces. The reason they didn't put huge forces in here is because of the Suwałki problem. And we'll go through that a bit later. But these are only there to hold off, and their primary goals are for the Estonians, hold Tallinn and the airfield here, because this airfield here will allow NATO to kind of strike pretty deeply into here, particularly toward Petersburg. The port here, Riga port, is absolutely huge. And if anyone has traveled to the Baltics will know they're kind of a lot of flights and everything go through Riga because it is a bit of a hub for logistics and transportation. There's a lot of storage areas there. So NATO would probably want to use this as your last stand. This is everything would be about Riga. So first day, NATO's panicking, or forward forces try and sort of hold the rail junctions. Nothing too special. Let's go next bit. So again, at this point, we're going to assume that the VDV are probably the only ones I would assume that would be easily able to not worry as much about rail. And you'll start to see, I wouldn't be shocked to see the airfield or the base out here and the rail junction get surrounded. To which case that puts NATO in a bit of a problem where you go, okay, well, do I hold this rail junction, which is going to slow the Russians down, but then we're likely to get ransomed off? And this is one of the sort of considerations that I think Putin might be making as well. Maybe if I can hold a capital, hold a few things and not destroy it, then I can say, hey, look, let's end the war here, or, I go into Tallinn and start burning things down. So this will be a big consideration of the force here, is how long do they stay? Because the moment you leave, it just opens the, rail corridor going south toward Riga. Yeah, again, you can see that the main punch is going to be up here in Estonia. Let's get that done first and worry about Latvia second, even though Latvia is probably more important defense-wise. Now, CSTO, I think was the next probably point I would say. No, the CSTO absolutely probably not going to get involved. Kazakhstan, they're trying to play nice with everyone at the moment. Not a chance. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan don't really have the capacity to. Belarus, as we went to. By Belarus staying in this kind of will they, won't they situation, you actually get a lot more advantage out of them. A, you don't have to go in and defend them. B, you're not having a giant hole or front to worry because you're actually defending against Poland. But by holding them in there, you actually hold a lot of Poland and Lithuania in check. It's only about 40 Ks from the Belarusian border to Vilnius. The Lithuanians are not going to pull their men out, even if they know and they have great intelligence that the Belarusians aren't going to get involved. It would be political suicide to go and chuck all your men from defending Vilnius up to go fighting, in Latvia, because then people would go, you're abandoning us, why are you doing this, yada, yada, yada. So by Belarus and Kaliningrad staying where they are, it does pin down a lot of forces, even if they don't have to get into the fighting, which is probably as useful as they're going to be. So let's go NATO response. Now, here we'll talk about the reason that NATO doesn't put a lot of troops up front. There's always been, prior to Finland and Sweden, the problem of Kaliningrad. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it's an absolute nest pit of anti-ship and anti-air missiles. So this is the rough range of most of the missiles inside Kaliningrad. Now, if you are NATO commanders, you see you're at this point of the war, Russia's pushed in, the Allies trying to reinforce, that would be a way of doing it. So effectively, you have to run this gauntlet of anti-air and anti-ship missiles, and you would lose quite a lot doing it. Because again, it's a lot easier to deny airspace and sea lanes than it is to occupy it. Could the Russian Baltic fleet control the Baltic Sea? Absolutely not. Could they make life really difficult to keep resupply going? Yeah. And then you also hit, and anyone who's sort of been and done our Sat there for our 3 hour Taiwan, big one. You hit that logistical problem of, okay, if your men are burning through, let's say, 10 units of ammunition and you lose 5 coming across through the sea, do you then the next day send 15 to try and make up the shortfall because you have to? But now you've got more targets to hit, and you end up in this exponential problem of putting more boats in while this is a problem. Air cover would be exactly the same problem because your main airfields you take off, and again, air supply is nowhere near as good as sea supply. You're going to still have to run over this problem. You're either going to have to go over Belarus or run over the air defense missiles. So this is actually, with Kaliningrad being here, is a major problem for the Allies if they're going to do this. And that was the consideration of, okay, if we get hit in the Baltics, do we pull out, back to Poland and hold in Poland and just abandon them? Or do we shove a bunch of men in and then effectively watch Suwalki get cut because that's only about 70 k's wide, and then we can't supply those men? And again, soldiers without ammunition are poorly dressed tourists at best. Then good old Finland and Sweden joined, and boom, whoops. Yeah, that kind of cooked the plan. Again, this was Russia's Hail Mary. This was the, and I probably would, if I were a betting man, suggest that if World War III or this scenario broke out, that Finland and Sweden would probably offer to use Swedish ports. But now, effectively, if shit was there at the fan, NATO could supply from Stockholm or from Finland, which is just here, and it's a very short run from Helsinki to Tallinn. So it's actually much more possible to supply men in there and keep them going, which is why NATO is thinking about upping their forces they keep in the Baltic states, because there is a sort of another conundrum of, if you, let's say, put, let's say the argument, 30,000 troops inside the Baltics, you now need to supply men, food, bandages, doctors, all the sort of fun stuff that comes with an army for 30,000 as well. And if you're burning through 30,000 men all eating every day, congrats, now you're in problem territory if you can't keep the supply going. If you've got Finland and Sweden, a lot easier. You've also got air cover as well, because you have a lot of great Swedish and Finnish airfields all around here. So we won't put him in the scenario yet. Like, this whole scenario, the reason that it was always concerning for planners was because it's so difficult to resupply NATO forces if Kaliningrad is still in play. And Kaliningrad's actually fairly well supplied with a whole bunch of goodies. Again, it's not designed as a force that can go push into Poland. I'm not going to see taking Warsaw anytime, but these guys are, what do we got? Let's take a look at Kaliningrad for a second. Backup rail networks. These are all fortified across here. They've got a guards motor rifle, a division, which is much bigger than a brigade, rockets, artillery, concentrated artillery, marines. There's some decent forces in Kaliningrad who are going to be nasty to take. Now, by this point, you've also seen our first Americans rocking up. These are our rapid response guys. So effectively, this is just guys from the 2nd Cav. They're not going to be hugely good fighters, but the Americans at this point will probably want to, even if they're on the fence, and maybe at this point we haven't had the NAC have their vote yet, if Americans die, the Americans are probably much more likely to get involved. And again, this comes down to who is president at the time. Americans will 100% die because they'll be in the bases up here. But if they die as part of an American unit, that might change calculuses. Again, this will be about stopping the tide, putting some men in to just make sure they can cut these rail junctions or convince the Russians at some point to stop. And you can see here that we've got this kind of where it's starting to bend around the border. Most times when people play this successfully is they don't go into Lithuania. And this would, by, let's say the 15th Brigade here, stopping, it would be a massive signal to NATO that, hey, Russia is not intending on going into Lithuania, or they will do it if we think it's possible. That would be a big signal for NATO, because now the NATO can just push a bunch of stuff into Lithuania and know that it's not going to get immediately attacked, and they might have time to solidify in, and hopefully they can draw pardon the pun, but a red line. So let's go see if there's anything fun up here in Estonia. Cool. So we can see in Estonia, the 2nd is already falling back again along that rail line, just starting to bring in your reserves. You're using your backup VDV to keep them fresh as a reserve and just take out bits and pieces. And we are starting to surround Tallinn. Again, the NATO force is falling back, just hoping to defend Tallinn. Armory is also likely to probably be under pretty heavy stress at this point. So let's go day 3.5. Again, these aren't exact days. These are just kind of like stages, I guess, just a better way to put it. Yeah, so pulling back, the NATO forces at this point know that now once, 98th has cut this rail line south, they're cornered. And now it will be a choice of, do you want to have all of these NATO forces from quite a few nations be auctioned off? It may be politically savvy. What do we got up there? We got French, Danish, Iceland, UK, and USA. Either any of those governments that you think may be not as keen about this conflict, you might want to pull out some of them, which you can, or you might just think, hey, look, we can't supply them up here. Once they're pushed back to Amri, let's pull them out and we'll put them back in Riga, where the defense is desperately going to be needed. We need every man we can get, and it's been better to hold a port there. So the question coming through, maybe a silly question, but given Russians' reliance on railroads, could Estonia and Latvia blow up the rail connections with Russia in case of invasion? How much would it slow them down? Not as much as you think. So the trouble with rail is that, let's take a explosive package. We chuck it in the floor, we blow it up. You only really blow up maybe 500 meters of rail. And again, the Russian rail forces are designed for this. They can build, as we said, 2 brigades. They can probably build 50 Ks of rail a day. They have specialty machinery this. So it's quite hard to sabotage rail. You can do rail bridges. So for instance, if they were to blow the rail junctions over here or blow the junction over Narva, yeah, that would slow things down. That's going to be really annoying to deal with, but it won't end the assault because Russia will bring some engineering and some sappers guys. It would just slow the whole invasion down. And again, a lot of this is about buying time. You're probably going to have just constant attacks on drones, but you have to bend that much steel. You need a heavier warhead that's going to be better off just targeting tanks at that point, and to get rid of that much rail. The bridges are useful. Everything else, you're just wasting your time. Well, you're not wasting your time, but I would rather be plunging that into Russian fuel stocks, Russian ammunition stocks, Russian, just general infantry units, rather than wasting it on rail repair lines that can be pretty easily fixed. So let's go to the next day. So effectively what we have here is NATO fleeing back to Amri, and Estonia, and logically, defensively, they'd probably be better off running off back to Riga as well. Defend the major port, hold it, and you can push out from there much easier. But politically, I can't see a nation abandoning their capital, particularly the Estonians, who feel quite proud. Now, everyone will talk about the massive reserves these countries can call upon. That's true, but this is a very short war. Reserves are, like with Ukraine, that the reserves and cadets they called up, they hit the battlefield on week 3, effectively, is the very, very first ones. Some of the guys just grabbed a rifle and went to the front, but to get them in actual units took a few weeks. Estonia is probably going to take even longer. If they can hold off, yeah, that's fine. If they think war's coming, they can do stuff about it. But the reserves, that massive reserve number they have, is not probably going to come into play at this point, unfortunately. Absolutely, the partisans and locals. It's a good question coming through as well about that. Absolutely. There'll be, anyone who even sneezes in Russian is going to get a nice saucepan over the back of the head. But that doesn't always stop things, as we've seen with Russian occupied areas in Ukraine. So next day, you can just see the absolute fist that we are pushing here with Russia. Now, this is now that a lot of these forces are going to start to be exhausted. That's a lot of advancing to do in a very short space of time. A lot of as you keep advancing at this kind of pace, you're going to have more of your gearboxes break, more of your ammunition barrels start to go problematic. You're going to have a lot of shells get misplaced. Problems are going to build up and up and up. And again, you're probably going to want to, if you can either take Tallinn, give them a rest, or even just hold and surround Tallinn. And this is the consideration that we talked about with nuclear war. That is, if Russia goes and smacks Tallinn and just burns the old city down, and Tallinn's an absolutely beautiful city, one of my favorite cities in the world. Russia burns it to the ground, they've got nothing to play with. If Russia surrounds Tallinn and doesn't go in, it does have something to bring to the negotiating table, saying, I will kill 1,000 Estonians every day that we don't declare peace. Again, horrible thought. But it does give something for them to amplify across Telegram, amplify across a lot of other media, and give a point to quickly negotiate when NATO probably has the upper hand. So if you're Russia, I don't see why you would, because you're either going to A, destroy Tallinn, lose a lot of men doing it, and then lose the war anyway and have to hand it back, or B, hold it as a trophy and auction it off for some sort of deal. So they'll surround Tallinn, and we're going to see the last defense of Amri. Now, the first of the Russians are going to reach the Baltic coast. Doesn't really matter that much, but at least it will get them some useful for propaganda, but also just it'd be nice to kind of make sure you can control Panu port put there, because they can just put a few missiles up here and make sure nothing comes through Panu. Now we are reaching the outskirts of Riga, and you've seen that none of these guys have seconds been pulled back. None of these guys have been pushed back. Everything will be about defending Riga, and Riga is actually a remarkably defendable city, despite despite World War II. So effectively, that's where we are at the moment, where they are barreling in for Riga, but they can defend here, and they are over the river. And this river is going to be a bit of a problem later on, but we'll talk about that. The Dugava River reserves. So what is NATO's response? Yes. So riot troops, anyone you can call up. If you are in this level of trouble, you will call anyone you can. There's a very big difference between if Latvia completely falls, and then you have to convince your Hungaries or stuff to go invade Latvia and go retake it back, versus an ongoing war that there is a chance that we can solve this, that decisions need to be made now. Because if Latvia was to fall, and this has always been the consideration, NATO goes, okay, let's do a proper build up. Let's actually get our logistics in place. Let's get stuff in. Let's bring the tanks. Let's really do this right. Great. That's a 60-day wait. And that 60 days, does your political coalition start to fall apart? And that's a real concern, because you might get to day 44 and people go, oh, yeah, no, I'm not as keen on this conflict anymore. I think, that's one of the sort of considerations. If you can hold Latvia, even keep that port open, or just keep Latvia on the cards, and there's constant fighting, it's a lot more difficult for people to say, hey, look, we're losing, we're dying, we're men are dying on the front. We need to keep sending them bullets and guns and everything else. So Latvia just digs in. Lithuania can start to chuck some troops closer to the border, even to just try and some Baltic hegemony, I guess. But again, they won't politically want to send too much in. This is the big event here. As we said, the signal from the last segment that the Russian forces are not going to enter Lithuania. So now NATO can just flood Lithuania with NATO troops, even if they are not well armed. And again, the guys I put in here are mostly the airborne or air assault from most of these armies. So they actually will be able to mobilize a lot quicker, and they will be lightly armed. It doesn't matter, because now Russia was already struggling with this. To see this amount of stuff already in Lithuania, you've just, even without firing a shot, guaranteed that Russia's not going to go into Lithuania. At this point, you're also going to start striking everything in Kaliningrad. NATO is going to have the air power, and they can do a lot more strike capacity in there, but there's going to be a lot of areas where I don't think they're going to be comfortable sending some bits of equipment. And again, it's just a risk versus reward thing. Could an F-35 get in there and blow up, I don't know, a fuel depot, whatever it is? Yeah, absolutely. But if there's a 2% risk you lose the F-35 to take out that one little bit of fuel, is it worth it? Very expensive. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And do you want to put that much stress on the airframe? You only have a certain amount of hours on these things, but you have to refit them. There is going to be a lot of considerations on what is going to be useful and what's there, and how many you have in the region. Again, on the very first days, you're going to have a lot of people considering we've got a very small amount of these. Pick our targets. Give it a week into this thing, and you've got F-35s pouring in from all over the world. Yeah, hell yeah, it moves. Let's blow it up. And now you have a bunch of drones as well. Like, the whole thing becomes easier at the effectively the 7-day point, because you've just got stuff pouring in from across the Atlantic. Okay, let's keep moving. So we're now just barreling further towards. You can see here that we are, abandoning the airbase out here and fleeing Estonia. Here we go. Question: will NATO go into Kaliningrad? Probably not. That's the other consideration, is if you are, for the sake of the argument, and you want to try and not freak the entire world out, you want to set your parameters for war and your rules of engagement real early, particularly to not freak the stock market out. So it's why, we went through this in much more detail in the Taiwan piece. But if Biden goes, this is about holding democracy and making sure that Russia doesn't take over the world, but we are not going to go invade Russia, then it becomes a lot easier for people to see there's going to be an end line. Because if you go and take Kaliningrad, well, that's actually Russia, unless you want to talk about German politics. If you go invade Russia, there is no end game. Do you want to actually have US troops marching toward Moscow? Not really. At that point, even if they get into Russia, then we're just massively upping the amount for nuclear war. I mean, the scenario where we have here that we don't take Kaliningrad, but we smack the Russians out of the Baltics and push them back over the border is everything NATO needs it to do. The Russians will be absolutely embarrassed. The Russians will have their back broken by this if they haven't already had it done by Ukraine. And we are much less unlikely to hedge a nuclear war, which is the primary worry. It gives an out for both sides, because if Russia then goes and agrees to just pull back over the border and say, oh, maybe Lithuania and Latvia aren't the red I thought they were, pull over the border, that could end the war. If NATO occupies Kaliningrad, can NATO pull back? Not politically. And then Russia can't pull back politically. And now you're stuck in this, the war could go a lot longer. So I think for the sake of making sure there's better parameters and keeping particularly the business community not freaking out that it's going to be a very long war, yeah, Kaliningrad is going to cop a lot of airstrikes. But what you would gain by conquering that territory, you already have by having Sweden and Finland in the alliance. Or you could just gain from blowing everything that moves up in there. It's not a huge advantage to have that area back. So let's go to the next day. So we have Estonian forces fleeing to Riga. We're now seeing these first American forces, and we're now having this question. I'll turn my flags off so you can see the problem in its infinite glory. This year, the Daugava River, most of it is on this side of the river, the railways, which is great. It means the Russians can effectively chuck, if they had spare ammunition here, they could just go and then go back up and down. Great for them. But right now they've got troops on the other side of the river, and there's only a few crossings, to which case every time they cross, congrats, you've just summoned every NATO drone and every NATO airstrike. This would be the first point that if you now really have NATO forces pushing in on Russia and really pushing back, and these are American forces, they're going to be pretty well armed at this point. They may not have dental, they may not have healthcare, but good God, they're going to have some anti-tank missiles and anti-tank weapons to throw at you. This would be the point where Russia will now be considering what to do, because they either now commit all their reserves and try and push right out to the border with Lithuania, or half their reserves and effectively pull back over the river, because river defense is much easier. Because if you're crossing a river, you effectively have to, let's turn a flag back on. I'm going to just explain this. Let's say, congrats, Czechia, you've been promoted. If Czechia manages to cross the river, aha, look at that, then they can get pummeled. And if you not have a bridge across the river, you can't really armored support or bring in the ammunition or bring in all your support that you needed to while you're stuck on that side of the river. It's why, the Russians have had real troubles crossing the rivers in Ukraine. Ukraine's had real troubles in the opposite way around as well. So again, railways are going to be everything on this one. So if I'm Russian command, I'm probably thinking, okay, do we have enough men to actually fight off this shitstorm of NATO stuff coming up the road and this shitstorm of NATO stuff up here? Or do we pull back to the river where we can defend a lot easier? We can even start to rest our troops, because we might be at day 3 or 4 at this point. And then even start to think about, where's my CSTO flags? There you are. Start to bring in some spares that have been a bit rested up here in Estonia, or even just bring in some more. Maybe we can take Riga, maybe we can't. But rivers are great ways to reduce the amount of troops, because if it's just plain ground, you're going to have to put, let's say, 10 men across this space of territory. If it's rivers, you probably only need 1 or 2, because then you can just, as soon as the guy crosses, just radio everyone and say, hey, look, the Czechs are across the river at this town. Everyone come and beat them up. And because the rail's there, they come and they beat them up. They get them out. So this would be the point where maybe this is as far as we get conversation. So day 6, you can see here that this is the first of the guys from up north arriving, and they're still we're now, 173rd is likely to rock up, because we're at day 6. Is about right. This is the other consideration that NATO will be worried about, is this bad boy. Look at that rail junction. Mwah, chef's kiss. That would be, if you were to ever plan an assault into Lithuania, this is the rail junction you want. It's on the other side of the river. That's great for them. But right now we have Russian troops on that side of the river. And if you think this is really, really important, we need to hold this at all costs. And most of our troops are either up near Riga trying to kick them in, or further up, maybe it's probably worth pulling back over the river with the 15th and holding there. We can hold the rail junction then, but we are going to have to give up this bit of territory here. And that's, if I were a betting man, if I were a general, if I were thinking about it, that's not a bad deal. Again, but we're already starting to see those decisions coming into play. We're already starting to think about solidifying and pulling back, which is not great if you're in day 6 of the conflict. So let's go next day. And this is what I mean by the problems, because NATO is just going to start smacking. A rail line junction is that close. Yes, a rail line junction is still close and effective, because let's say if the war does reach a somewhat of a stalemate and we end up in a kind of 2016-ish Ukraine scenario where there's a war, but it kind of is quiet, it does allow that if the war were to kick off, ammunition can go flying anywhere, even just to keep your men supplied becomes a lot cheaper. So if this is the new front line, which effectively, spoiler alert, that's where we're, but couldn't a simple Alibaba drone, yeah, they can absolutely destroy the rail line. But as we kind of went through a little bit earlier, if you punch a hole in a rail line, even with an Alibaba drone, you might dig a 2-meter hole in it, which is going to take a railway troop about 20 minutes to fix, which is not a great use of a drone. If you can plunge that into a HQ or a tank or a targeting system or a radar, that is a far better use of your time. So if, let's say, sake of the argument, because that's where we're actually heading, is this is the front line, the river, having that rail is a pretty good place to be, because anytime, let's say, the Americans try to jump across the river, they take this little spot here, you can then rush your reserves pretty up and down this rail line. If you were hoping for a defensive line, this is a really good place to dig your troops in, because you can really quickly resupply. Once someone crosses the river, it's a pain in the ass. You got rail junctions here, here, and here. There's 3 of them. That's great. It's also not a huge, from Veliki Luki, not a huge run to bring in stuff. So that's, you don't even need to worry about Belarus if Belarus goes south on this. If this were a place to stop, it probably would be a good place to stop. Day 7. Yeah, so that's what the front line roughly looks like in our scenario. That, in fact, it probably looks closer to that. So that is effectively what the Russians will be sitting on, and that is as far as they are probably going to get. So this is effectively where Russia would probably be looking to talk peace terms. They're holding Tallinn hostage. They're on a much stronger position than a lot of people probably want to imagine they are across the river. And now NATO is in that question of, do we want to, push in and lose a lot of men doing so, actually have a big nasty fight with Russia and push them out of the Baltics? I think NATO probably in reality would be happy to go down that road and push them off. This is the best that Russia can hope for. Best case scenario, this is what they want to get. And they hope that by that point, maybe people can push back from the table and say, we will leave Tallinn to be a standing great little city. We're going to leave Riga alone, and maybe we will leave the Baltics, but you cannot deploy any NATO forces in the Baltics. And that might be Russia's, what they ask for in negotiations. NATO going to do it? Probably not. I think NATO, if at this point, would be more than happy to give them a smack, but I don't think they'll go into Russia. But that's the best case scenario. So again, we were talking about the Soviet stuff 6 weeks ago whenever we did the last one. We're talking about the Soviets were planning on reaching the border with Spain. Now we're talking the best they can really hope for is to get down here. And that's where most war games, when you play this out, do end up stuck at about this point, because now this is the safe zone and the best defensible area you're going to find. Fight, hold on, and make it as painful as possible for NATO to come get it, hoping that NATO doesn't have the political will to go get it. Now, the fantasy scenario, if I, were a Russia boo and just watched Russia Today all day, let's play the secret plan that they would probably want to go through, because I think it is worth probably talking about very quickly. The Suwalki problem is what people worry about. And there's always been, when Russia was a bit stronger, a talk of get the allies to this point where they've chucked all their men into Lithuania, into the Baltics, and then now you've revealed my trap card. At this point, Russia would rush 20th Combined Arms Army, as well as 106th Airborne. 106th Airborne got pretty mauled in Ukraine, though. Bring them in quickly and effectively engage all up and down that river line whilst the Allies are distracted, and then push in and try and close the Suwalki Gap. So this is the nightmare scenario of what happens if Russia then closes the Suwalki Gap, because now there is no direct rail line or supply line between effectively Poland and all these NATO forces in there. They're now trapped. This is the question or decision you'd have to make of either does Poland or all the Allies try and smash in and take open Suwalki by force, or do you pull back and, fight another day somewhere else? Particularly if you've got all in your rear here. If in this weird scenario, NATO was dumb enough to not defend the rear at all, just didn't see any of this coming. This is your communications guys, you guys who are not ready for frontline fighting. Maybe they get overrun. And if we get to sort of this point, does NATO panic and start pulling out and considering a retreat back into Poland? Because from Poland, you can easily defend them. And this is what will kill NATO forces is they'll run out of shit really quickly, because NATO will, particularly some of the newer troops, if they're panicked, maybe the first time it's in combat, they're just going to burn through ammunition. And there's not going to be as much ammunition just sitting around, laying around to do stuff. This is the difference between sort of the Ukraine problem and the Baltic problem. That doesn't matter. With Ukraine, there's a whole bunch of borders there you can bring ammunition over. There's no way of cutting off Ukraine. There is very much a way of cutting off the Baltics. That would be, again, we're being incredibly generous, thumb on the scale for the Russians here. But yes, if I were the Americans, I would be absolutely barreling everything I could heavy and putting a bunch of self-propelled guns inside the Suwalki Gap. But we're being generous here to kind of show and demonstrate what the concept of Suwalki was, rather than what, in reality, I think the Americans can probably defend it. It is a piece of shit to get through, though. Even the Germans had real trouble getting through it because it's just pretty heavy forest. There's only a few highways. It's a bit of a pain. So next one. Yep. You can see here the Americans panic and they decide to get the hell out of Dodge. And then it's just a free run, pretty much to the ports to get out that way, or via Riga. Next one. And everyone pulls back to fight another day. And we end up with, that is the scenario that the most pro-Russia people will give you. Again, I think it's not really possible. I think what we had back in P8, whatever it was probably the most likely endpoint, to which that's a negotiated settlement, and the best Russia can hope for is maybe end of hostilities. You can see here that why Russia probably won't do this now, because you are massively risking breaking the back of the Russian army, what's left of it. You're massively risking nuclear war to gain, what was it? It was like, a handful of bits and pieces. That's not really, is that worth the nonsense you're going to have to go through? Probably not. It doesn't really. The Russian defensive position is a bit better. It pushes some of the really short range stuff out of range of Petersburg, but that's the best case scenario. Let's quickly go through Finland, because I know everyone's time is precious. Let's take a look at your Nordics. So let's talk pre-war. So here are the Nordic deployments. There's actually not a lot up here. This is all about small, quick, mobile, smash and run kind of tactics. The big things to defend, Russia would absolutely think this is the primary worry, is the Murmansk and Severomorsk. Been up there, lovely. Everyone is filthy alcoholics. In Norway's got bugger all. They're not expecting much. Finland's can be a big one. Finland has a far better military than I think a lot of people assume, and we'll go through why, but Sweden's also not doing too badly. But yeah, you can see Russia doesn't expect to be dealing with lots of problems up here. That's changing. Effectively, they are reopening what they're calling Leningrad Command, which is effectively making this a defense zone, because they are now worried about Finland. But I don't see it getting anywhere near the resources that any of the other commands. The concern for Russia is always going to be this bit here, because if our little Jaeger guys here can punch through and they could take that rail line, there is now absolutely no connection between Russia and Murmansk, which would mean effectively having to go all the way to Vladivostok and cross the Arctic to resupply, or try and go for Arkhangelsk, which again is not a port I would want to be relying on to do that kind of capacity. Yeah. Let's go and actually talk Finland because we'll race through that. Okay. Pre-war, you can see the rail. Now here, the Finnish rail lines are amazing. For the Baltics, it's a massive liability that they're using Russian gauge rail. For the Finns, they've weaponized it because it is absolute spiderweb problem for the Russians. So the classic problem is one here. If you, let's say, go and advance down the road and get to here, now you can either get all the way to Lahti, and haha, you think you're close to Helsinki, but Graz, you've now opened up this entire flank to go hit you from here or from the back. Because the Finns are so full of rail and so movable and so mobile, effectively the Russians will have to either keep so many men defending the supply columns, which means you reduce the speed you can advance, or try and go for the advanced speed they're looking for and have supply columns that are consistently going to get hit. Particularly guys, like you can see here, the Jägers, effectively their entire job will be to take the first hits when they come in and then just potter around and smack into anything that speaks Russian for a while. Because again, a tank is a wonderful, brilliant bit of equipment and kit until it runs out of fuel. And that was the problem when you see these tanks getting pulled away by Ukrainian farmers. It's not because the Ukrainian farmer was an expert marksman. It's because the tank ran out of fuel. And the Ukrainians got really good in the early stage, and they still do, of, why go target really difficult targets when you can just hit fuel trucks? Because once you get the fuel trucks, it doesn't matter about everything else. The tanks, they're useless anyway. So it's almost guaranteed that the Finns will, even in that first couple of days when the war kicks off and you're stabilizing still, you're getting your reserves in, you're probably bringing in allies and friends, they're just going to beat out of the Russian supply lines. And the Finns have the most perfect, custom-made, brilliant little, you can strike from the back. So for deployment, who did I assign to this one? I gave the 35th Combined Arms Army. So they've been pulled from Belgorod, the 31st Brigade of V2V, and I pulled them from Ulyanovsk, and I pulled the 11th Brigade of V2V from Ulan-Ude, because those guys are used to cold fighting. Again, not the best ones you do, but I tried to go for units that haven't been completely destroyed by Ukraine. So give it some credibility. So again, you can see the Russian problem here, that their rail lines aren't really designed to go into Finland either, because they've only got, even this rail is kind of, entrance has been closed at the moment. Still usable, and you could technically connect this up, but you'd have to get through a bunch of shitty forest and dirt roads. So only the VDV are going to do it effectively. So again, you're now advancing your entire army down one rail line against a army whose entire training has been designed to take guys named Ivan down. You're not looking at a Baltic state, you're looking at a pretty nasty operation here. So let's go next, day one. Obviously, lots of strikes across targets all over the place. They're going to want to hit communication centers, the same kind of stuff. But the rail junctions are going to be the most important. If you take the rail junction here, then maybe it's going to be harder for them to come down from here and smack you. If you can take the rail junction, and this is the kind of thunder run they'd want, is this one. Because at least if you can hold either this one or this one, you stop your supply line getting smacked from the north. But it can get smacked from this here. That's this is what I mean. There's just too many rail junctions in Finland to worry about, and not enough rail junctions from St. Petersburg up to Finland to be able to supply them properly. Because again, if you are using, the more men you put on there, the less you have to go around. Let's say 10 units of ammunition or whatever it is going up here, chuck 30 units in and now everyone gets 3 bullets. One holds the bullet, one holds the gun, might actually become a reality. So we're going to have to keep things fairly minimal and troop-wise, and at the same time running along single tracks whilst trying to keep multiple railheads going is just, again, you can already see the nightmare that is Finland. So the Karelia guys are going to come in. The Jaeger stuff, those guys are not going to be staying around for too long. They're not useful for that. They are hit and run, pretty good at attacking the supply lines. Once they can disengage and leave Karelia to hold that rail line, that's what they're going to do. That's the best use for them. These guys will now just start barreling in from all over the sides. And if I were the Russians, I'd be starting to panic, because already you don't really have a reserve anywhere, because you now have to spread yourself, across here. And there's very little way to connect these guys and be able to reinforce each other. You either have to take both these railheads, or make sure you can maintain a rail that is really shitty through here. It hasn't been maintained very well. So that's not a great position to be in. Effectively, these guys, like the paratroops here, are just expected to please defend, stop these guys coming down from here and just smacking through. That's, they're already reaching extremities, and we're, I don't know, 2% of Finland occupied. And it's, again, Finland do have really good soldier programs. They do a lot of training. They are pretty well kitted out, but it's mostly the geography and the train lines and logistics and the purpose built to cook Russia that's going to actually be the problem for Russia here. So again, now you have a choice of, if you really want to make sure that, these guys can't get surrounded, or that you can't have men smack your supply lines when you try to go to Helsinki, you need to take this rail junction here. And that's a pretty difficult rail junction to take, considering that you're having to now bring in across this same train line all your stuff up from Petersburg through Viborg into here, whilst also supplying all the way up here. And those duty Jaegers, I'll put them here, but they are going to just be running around doing their thing, whilst there's an armored brigade sitting right there, which, if you're fighting an armored brigade, means you're going to actually have to do some fighting, particularly if they're dug in, and they will be dug in by the time you get there, because the Finns will move a lot faster on these railroads than you will. So again, we're just reinforcing that railway. We're keeping that open, because at the moment, if this railroad remains in, Pixmarky Junction to be precise, that's the one. If they can hold that railroad, it makes any advance past up to Lahti vulnerable. And that's the real problem they have here, is you can't go further than that without taking that. And that's a pain in the ass to take, because if you take that, then you're vulnerable from here. And if you need to take that, then you're vulnerable from here. So it's an interlocking defense system, which is really interesting. They've weaponized Russian trains. So Russia's going to keep fighting. We're just sort of showing that the Jaeger guys will just attack the back end, because this area here is just marshy, muddy nonsense. I wouldn't, want to rely on the Karelia guys to go do that fight. But the Karelia guys are just there to hold and smack Russian tanks. Now, by this point, Sweden is, I think we're like 3 or 4, I think. Sweden will actually begin to rock up. Even before Sweden entered NATO, I would be shocked if Sweden didn't get involved, because frankly, the Swedes have got purpose-built weapons and purpose-built technology for this exact cause. And they know that if Finland fell, well, Sweden would be the next on the chopping block. You'd always much rather, if you're Sweden, fight in Finland than you would fight in Sweden. Sweden doesn't have the kind of nonsense train networks. It doesn't have a lot of the terrible terrain that is just great in Finland. So sending a couple of guys over there, easiest decision you could probably make. So in this scenario, we're going to have the Karelia guys pull back to the next rail junction. And this is the trouble, that they can just pull back to another rail junction. And even if they lose this rail junction, which again, I don't think they even would have to, but let's say they do, they can just pull back to this rail junction. And if the Russians are dumb enough to then go all the way down to Helsinki, then congrats, boop, they just pop back and they attack the rail junction that has their supply line again. You see this kind of, every single step, Russia either needs to take all of the rail junctions or it doesn't work, because it just absolutely opens you up the vulnerabilities. So you guys can pull back. Yeah, and the Finns can pull back. There's a lot more ammunition dumps and supply stuff around here that will help them stay afloat than the Russians are going to have to come in. And they can bring in stuff from all over the areas. They've got a lot more airfields. They can land stuff out if they need to. And NATO will probably be sending them a bunch of stuff as well. So I just got a comment. Attacking Finland seems like pushing your arm deeper and deeper into a hornet's nest. The further you go, the more agony you are introduced to. Exactly. That is probably the best analogy for Finnish defense I've ever heard. The further you get in, the worse it's going to get. So let's say they want to take Pixmarky. They really want to go for it. That's a big fight to do. And they probably don't have the supply line to do so. Even if we manage to get out here, which you might get to that point where if they get to only here and here, you're going to have Putin probably calling commanders and saying, give me a victory. Why is this not working? It's Finland, This is a nation of depressed Swedish wannabes. Why can't we get this? Just to annoy you, Ali. That may force them to go and push offensive to points where they probably shouldn't. As we can see here, by pushing up and trying to chase the Karelia guys out here, oh, look, those armored guys now just have a nice little open smack ready to go. So what's the next day? Yeah, next one. So, and now we can see the UT Jaegers are just cutting off the supply lines. And that's all you have to do. Even if the Porty guys just barely hold on to it, even if they lose the rail junction, now it's too late. You know, if you are, what is this, 37th Guards, you are sitting there going, shit, shit, shit. I've got Swedish forces coming in down the road. I am lost my supply lines, even if they don't have to occupy. Again, there's a big difference between taking ground and holding ground, or even just denying ground. And the Jaegers don't need to take; they can deny, because if you don't feel comfortable sending your fuel trucks down this train line, then are you going to send double the amount of fuel trucks because you expect to lose half? Well, that's a very exponentially bad problem. You're starting to see this nest of issues that continuously pops up. So let's go to the next one, because I know we're running out of time here. And day 5. Yep. So we're already seeing the Pixmaki is too far off the bat. If I were Russia, I'd be thinking about, okay, we're going to lose this. Let's at least keep this entrance here open and try and at least leave an exit route, because the last thing you'd want is to lose this area here and have your 37th Guards trapped. So let's try and give them a way out. You can see more Swedish rocking out, and you can see there's just great little there's some roads here that Sweden could use. Yeah, it's slower, and particularly you want lighter troops, which is why the Norland guys can kind of cross things that maybe aren't rail. And Russia, if this scenario is going on and it's going poorly, now defending this stupidly long bit of train line, because if it gets cut, if you can occupy 2 towns on it, Murmansk has nothing. And that is the primary home of Russia's second strike capability. Without the nuclear strike capability and the submarines up there, Russia, some would argue, isn't even a great power. So they can't even redeploy too much because they need to make sure that this road stays open. It just makes things a lot more difficult. It's an easy way for Finland and Sweden effectively to keep a lot of stuff in check. So let's get out of Nordic and go back to Finland. Okay. And you can see here that this is the decisions of, okay, well, if I'm, fighting Ali and the Karelia guys, do I pull back to a rail junction where I might feel more comfortable, where I'm only 1 rail junction away from effectively pulling back to Viborg or keeping my supply lines open, or do I, but you do that, now you're in the retreat. We are already in this point of, we need to keep a door open in case we need to get out, because if Finland exits the war with 20,000 Russian prisoners, that's a much better position to be in than it was if they just pull back over the border. And this is, you can just see the problems are mounting. If you've got squeezing from both sides, and you are, even if your guards are doing really well and Karelia is down to just Aliheim and 3 darts, I would still pull the guys back, because even if you manage to win that battle as the 138th, okay, could you take Helsinki with that? Absolutely not. Could you take the rail junction? Absolutely not. Now you're stuck in well, it's not even worth me winning the battle. I might as well reinforce. And if you're doing that point, well, now we're getting smacked from too many sides. We're losing all this as well. What's the point of being here? Do I want to be in a giant war with Finland and Sweden and very much losing, which is not going to be a great look for the Russian politicians whose names rhyme with Vladimir Putin? Yeah, I would not want to be in that situation where that's all I'm owning at that point. So at that point, it's probably worth just pulling out. And that's what we pretty much have here. Let's maybe take the junction here, but at that point, you're not going to gain anything from owning territory up here, because the Finns probably aren't going to push too much into this area here, because once the Finns have this amazing defense system set up ready to go up here, now you're going to be relying on Russian rail, and the Finns will be in the same problems that the Russians will. That even if they can make it down to here, great. Now you're right in the way of really short range Russian stuff, and Russians can kind of pin you from a few sides. So it gets much more difficult to go into Russia, like it gets much more difficult to go into Finland. So the most likely scenario is pretty much just the Finns push them out and get to brag for the rest of eternity. You think there was a lot of sniper memes before? Reddit will be insufferable after this. So the real concern, there is one scenario that does concern me in all of this. And because I think Russia knows that Finland's not on the cards. They know that going into the Baltics is a huge risk for very little reward. Narva does worry me, though. So Narva is, anyway, close soon. But here, right on the border with Finland and Russia. The city is about 90% ethnically Russian. It's all Russian television. There's a lot of good feelings towards Russia in the city. Yeah, I'm trying to choose my words very carefully. Most people at the bars will speak Russian. The trouble is, though, it's part of Finland. It's part of Estonia. Now, there is a nightmare scenario of effectively, that the Russians go and let's say there's riots inside Narva. Now, there may be Estonian policemen cracking down on Russian protesters. It could just even be fire kicking off or just something happening in Narva. And Russia sends men across not to invade, but just to maybe stop the riots or maybe to put the fire out or something of that variety. And then NATO rock up because there is no good deployment sitting in Narva. There's really just a couple of border guard guys because they don't want to give that opportunity for antagonism. What does NATO do? And this is the real conundrum that if I don't know how many NATO countries you could convince to go and go fire upon the Russians, even though every NATO commander I speak with always says every inch of NATO is sovereign, but it would be very hard to convince some NATO countries to go and fight back for Narva. Yeah, it's like the Estonian Kinmen. That's the best. It's a really good way to put it. But if you don't fire upon it, you just let the Russians occupy Narva, well, you start a territorial dispute, things get real weird. Now Article 5 gets called into question. Are we as secure as we probably once thought we were? Oh, NATO abandoned Russia. It will be just endlessly talked about as a NATO failed and NATO bowed to the Russians. And it puts them in a no-lose scenario because either NATO has to go fire upon Russians, which I think right now they probably would if Ukraine wasn't as going on and maybe there's a different president in the White House. It gets a little bit harder to determine what might happen. But that, in my mind, the nightmare scenario is that they take Narva or they come over on a good premise, something, stopping riots, taking a fire down, and they just don't leave because they have the goodwill to be there. Yeah, it's problematic. But if you then do the opposite and chuck a bunch of NATO forces in Narva because there's so many Russians and there's almost certainly going to be bar fights or there's going to be some drunken American who will go punch a Russian, and does that then up the risk of this happening? And that's the other consideration NATO will make. So that is the nightmare scenario out of them. And that's the one I think is the most plausible. And again, that's why I put this at the end of the presentation. But in any case, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's 4:30 my time, so I'm going to head to bed. But until then, thanks for listening. Thanks to all the staff who helped out on this one. And thanks to everyone else who tuned in.